It was supposed to be a quiet Saturday morning. The kind of morning when you get things done around the house and feel proud of yourself by noon. The sun was high, the sky perfectly blue, and the cul-de-sac of Maplewood Estates was unusually still, except for the faint hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. I had just finished changing the locks on my front door. It wasn't a big deal, at least not to me. The previous set had started sticking, and the key sometimes refused to turn unless you jiggled it just right. So I decided to replace them myself. After all, it was my house. But in neighborhoods like Maplewood Estates, my house didn't mean much to certain people, especially not to Carol Whitmore, the self-proclaimed guardian of community standards and reigning president of the HOA. Carol lived directly across the street. Her blinds were always at half-mast, like a ship in mourning, and everyone knew she spent most of her time peering through them. You couldn't so much as water your plants without her filing a friendly reminder note about maintaining curb appeal. So, when she noticed me changing the locks, tools spread across the porch, doorknob halfway removed, she must have thought she'd caught me doing something scandalous. At first I didn't notice her watching, but I should have known. I should have felt the weight of those eyes pressing through the window pane, her mug of tea hovering in judgment. It wasn't until I heard the click of her phone camera that I turned and saw her standing there, zooming in on me like she was documenting a crime scene. I shook my head, choosing to ignore her. It wasn't worth engaging. Carol had made everyone's life miserable in one way or another, and I'd seen neighbors fall into her traps before, verbal spats that somehow turned into official HOA violations or unfriendly conduct citations. But ignoring her didn't mean she'd ignore me. By the time I was installing the final screw, I noticed her outside, crossing the street in her pink cardigan and oversized sunglasses, her HOA badge clipped to her chest like she was on official duty. Even from a distance, her voice carried. Though I couldn't hear her words clearly, I knew the tone. That syrupy, sweet, condescending tone that always came before a threat. She gestured toward my door, waved her phone, then pointed at me as if she were making some grand declaration of guilt. I stayed calm, finished tightening the last screw, and stepped inside. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. 20 minutes later, I heard sirens. Not distant ones. They were coming down the street, echoing between the identical beige houses and perfectly trimmed hedges. I stepped outside just in time to see two police cruisers pulling up in front of my home. Carol stood proudly in the middle of the street, phone still in hand, a smug grin spreading across her face. She looked like she'd just won something, like justice was about to be served, and she'd finally put another rule-breaker in their place. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains and doorways, whispering. A few gathered in their driveways, curious. In Maplewood Estates, nothing was more exciting than a little drama, and Carol always delivered. The officers stepped out of their cars. I noticed how quickly they assessed the scene, scanning me, then glancing toward Carol. One of them placed a hand near his holster, and the other approached slowly. Carol pointed directly at me, talking fast, her arms flailing dramatically. I could already guess what she'd told them, that I was breaking into a home, maybe even stealing property. The officers approached, cautious but calm. I stood still, hands visible, not wanting to make things worse. But then something strange happened. The moment one of the officers looked at my ID, his entire demeanor shifted. His posture straightened, his tone softened. Then the other officer joined him, glanced at the ID, and exchanged a quick look. What came next caught everyone off guard, especially Carol. The officers stepped back, then saluted. Carol's grin vanished. The neighbors went silent, and all I could think was, oh, she's not going to like this. That was the moment everything in Maplewood Estates changed, though none of them knew it yet because the woman who had spent years making everyone else's life miserable had just picked the wrong person to mess with. And that salute. It was only the beginning. The salute changed everything. It was a moment so unexpected, so completely out of the ordinary for a quiet suburban cul-de-sac, that it rippled through Maplewood Estates like a stone dropped in still water. One second, Carol was standing there gloating, convinced she had caught me breaking some sacred neighborhood rule, or perhaps even committing a crime. The next, her expression froze in confusion, her jaw slightly open as both officers straightened up, pressed their hands to their foreheads, and saluted me in perfect synchronization. The silence that followed was almost comical. The hum of the distant lawnmower cut out. The wind died down. Even the neighborhood dogs, usually loud at the faintest sound of a car door, seemed to pause. And then just like that, it was over. The officers nodded, said something quietly to me, and then turned toward Carol. Whatever they said next made her step back, her confidence unraveling before the watching eyes of her neighbors. She stammered, gestured wildly toward my house, and pointed at me again. But this time her hands trembled. Within minutes, the cruisers were gone. The flashing lights disappeared down the road, leaving Carol standing there alone in the middle of the street, looking like someone who had just realized the rules of the game had changed. I didn't say a word. I simply went back inside, closed my newly installed door, and locked it, just to remind myself how sweet that sound could be. But while the police had left, the chaos they stirred didn't. Because in Maplewood Estates, nothing ever stayed quiet for long. By evening, the gossip had spread faster than wildfire. The neighborhood Facebook page was already exploding with speculation. Posts titled "Police at Maplewood" and "What Happened at Lot 42" popped up within hours. Some claimed I had been arrested and released. Others said Carol had made a false report. A few, mostly those who had actually seen the salute, whispered that something about me had made the police show respect. That last part seemed to intrigue people the most. The next morning, when I stepped outside to grab my mail, I could feel the eyes again. Curtains twitching, doors cracking open. Even people walking their dogs slowed down as they passed by. Everyone wanted to know, why had the police saluted me? And while they speculated, Carol was unraveling. By midday, she had posted a long official statement on the HOA community page. It was a rambling paragraph accusing me of engaging in suspicious activity and claiming she had only acted in the best interest of neighborhood safety. She reminded everyone that her authority as HOA president gave her the right to report possible infractions, but her usual followers, the ones who typically supported her campaigns, to measure mailbox heights or enforce the approved mulch color list, weren't as quick to back her this time. The salute had changed the narrative. People wanted answers, and Carol had none that made sense. Later that afternoon, I saw her again. She was standing by her mailbox talking to her husband, her gestures sharp and frustrated. Every now and then, she'd glance toward my house, her expression tight with something that looked like fear, or maybe embarrassment. She had always thrived on control. Control of the HOA board, control of the narrative, control of the neighbors. But that control was slipping through her fingers, and everyone could see it. What Carol didn't know, what none of them knew, was the real reason for that salute. It wasn't something I flaunted. It wasn't even something I wanted attention for, but it was the truth. Before moving to Maplewood Estates, I had served in the military for over 20 years. My last position had been as a decorated officer, and during my career I had worked closely with law enforcement agencies across the state. The officers who arrived that day recognized my name and rank instantly. Their salute had been a sign of respect, nothing more, nothing less. But in a neighborhood obsessed with gossip, a simple gesture of respect became something larger, a mystery, a symbol, a crack in Carol's untouchable image, and it didn't take long for the fallout to begin. 2 days after the incident, the HOA held an emergency board meeting. Normally, these meetings were quiet affairs, attended only by Carol and a few of her allies. But this one drew a crowd. Neighbors gathered in the small clubhouse, eager to hear Carol's explanation for the police drama that had put their perfect community in the spotlight. From what I later heard, things didn't go as she planned. Carol opened the meeting by reaffirming her commitment to safety and trying to justify her call to 911. But when pressed for details, she fumbled. She couldn't explain why she thought a homeowner changing his own locks was suspicious, nor could she answer why the police had saluted the supposed suspect. Every question chipped away at her authority. Every silence made her smaller. One by one, her supporters turned quiet, and in the corner of the room someone whispered what everyone was thinking. She went too far this time. The next morning, a letter was slipped under my door. Anonymous. Typed. Unsigned. It read only, "She's been doing this for years. You might finally be the one to stop her." I folded it up and set it aside. I hadn't planned to start a war with the HOA, but it seemed one had already begun. Over the following week, Carol tried to regain her footing. She doubled down on rule enforcement, citing people for leaving trash bins out too long, for parking too close to curbs, for not trimming their hedges evenly. It was her way of reasserting power, but it only made things worse. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began pushing back. They started questioning the legitimacy of her decisions, bringing up my incident as an example of her overreach. The tipping point came when someone posted doorbell camera footage of the police salute online. Within hours, it spread across local social media groups. The caption read simply, "When the HOA president calls the cops on the wrong homeowner." It went viral overnight. By the end of the week, Carol's name was everywhere, and not in the way she liked. The once feared HOA president was now the punchline of jokes, memes, and community gossip. But while most people laughed, I couldn't shake a strange feeling. Because the look on Carol's face that day, when she realized who she was dealing with, wasn't just embarrassment. It was something deeper. It was fear. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Because people like Carol didn't just give up control, they plotted to get it back. After the humiliation of that day, Carol didn't retreat quietly. People like her never did. They didn't know how. Losing control wasn't something she could tolerate. Not after years of ruling Maplewood Estates with an iron clipboard and a fake smile. Her reputation was everything, and in her mind, I had taken that from her. For the first few days, she tried to save face. She smiled too wide when neighbors passed by, waved a little too enthusiastically, and pretended not to notice when conversation stopped as she approached. But underneath that forced cheerfulness, something was brewing. You could feel it. A sort of tension humming in the air every time she appeared. It was the look of a woman plotting her comeback. It began with the letters. The first one came folded neatly and slipped under my door. A courtesy notice, printed on official HOA stationery. It stated that I had violated Article 4, Section C of the Community Guidelines by making unauthorized modifications to the exterior of the property. The supposed infraction: changing my locks. I laughed when I read it. It was absurd. But the letter wasn't about rules. It was a message. Carol was reminding me that in her mind, she still held power. Over the next week, more letters followed, each one nitpicking something new. My trash can placement, the color of my porch light, even the height of my grass, which I had mowed just 2 days earlier. Each notice came with escalating warnings and potential fines. It would have been laughable if not for the relentlessness of it all. Carol wasn't just enforcing the rules, she was weaponizing them. The neighbors noticed too. People started whispering that she was on a rampage, that she was going after me out of spite. Some even told me quietly that they'd received similar letters after defending me online or liking one of the posts about the salute video. It was as if Carol had declared a silent war, and anyone who didn't side with her became collateral damage. But the real trouble started when she went beyond paperwork. One evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something strange. A man I didn't recognize walking along the side of my house, clipboard in hand, taking photos. When I approached, he quickly walked away, muttering something about property inspection. The next day, another letter arrived, this time citing me for possible unapproved landscaping modifications. I hadn't changed anything about my yard. The only explanation was that Carol had sent someone to look for something, anything, to use against me. At that point, I knew I had two options. I could fight her the way she fought everyone else, with pettiness and paperwork, or I could do something different, something that would end this once and for all. So I started collecting evidence. Every letter, every notice, every photo she took from across the street. I kept it all. I documented dates, times, even the tone of her emails. I also talked to neighbors who had been harassed before, gathering statements about her behavior. The more I learned, the more I realized how deep it went. Carol had been running the HOA like her personal kingdom for years. She fined people unfairly, used HOA funds for personal projects, and intimidated anyone who questioned her authority. Most homeowners were too afraid to fight back. They didn't want to risk being targeted. But after the police incident, her fear-based control had started to crumble. The moment the community saw her lose face, something shifted. People weren't scared anymore. They were angry, and anger is contagious. By the second week after the incident, whispers turned into conversations. Conversations turned into plans. A small group of neighbors, tired of the endless nitpicking and control, started meeting in secret. They called it the Maplewood Reform Committee, though the name was more ambitious than the group itself. Their goal was simple: remove Carol from power. I wasn't planning to lead them. I just wanted to live in peace. But once they learned about the evidence I had, the documentation of her harassment, the fabricated violations, they asked for my help. Meanwhile, Carol was unraveling faster than anyone realized. She started patrolling the neighborhood in her golf cart again, clipboard on her lap, stopping to take photos of mailboxes and trash bins. But this time, people didn't lower their heads or look away. They stood there watching her, silent but defiant. One neighbor even mowed his lawn while blasting the military salute video on a speaker, letting it loop until she drove away. The more she pushed, the more resistance she faced. But instead of backing down, she escalated. Late one night, around 11 p.m., I noticed headlights flash across my living room window. Someone was idling outside my house. When I looked through the blinds, I saw Carol's car parked across the street. She sat there for several minutes, lights off, engine running. Then she drove away. The next morning, another violation notice appeared in my mailbox, this time citing me for late-night disturbances. It was the kind of psychological warfare she excelled at. Petty, invasive, and exhausting. But what she didn't know was that her own tactics were digging her grave. Every fake violation, every misuse of authority, every act of retaliation was being recorded and documented. By the end of the month, the Reform Committee had everything it needed: financial irregularities, abuse of power, witness statements, and even video proof of her harassment. And that's when we discovered the most shocking thing of all. While reviewing the HOA's public financial records, one of the neighbors, an accountant, noticed discrepancies, small amounts missing from the HOA maintenance fund, payments to unverified contractors, invoices that didn't match real companies. The pattern was subtle but clear. Carol had been siphoning money from the HOA budget for years. The story was no longer about a nosy HOA president and a lock-changing homeowner. It was about corruption, abuse, and greed. The Reform Committee decided to act. They filed a formal complaint with the HOA Oversight Board and requested an audit. When the audit notice arrived, Carol's calm, polished facade finally cracked. Witnesses said she showed up to the next HOA meeting pale and shaking, clutching a folder of documents that she wouldn't let anyone else see. She tried to stall, to dismiss the complaint as fabricated. But it was too late. The board scheduled a full review, one that could remove her permanently if the allegations proved true. And while she still had her title for the moment, her power was gone. The neighbors who once feared her now spoke openly against her. Her friends avoided her. Even her husband had started parking on the opposite side of the street, away from the tension. But if there was one thing everyone in Maplewood Estates had learned, it was this: Carol Whitmore didn't lose gracefully. And as the date of her hearing approached, she began acting stranger than ever, whispering to herself during her walks, staring at my house for long stretches, and sending cryptic notes about the truth coming out soon. It was clear she was planning something. Something desperate. Something final. By the time the audit notice reached Carol's mailbox, the calm facade of Maplewood Estates had already begun to splinter. The once pristine neighborhood that had prided itself on order and conformity was now a battlefield of whispered conversations, suspicious glances, and a brewing sense of rebellion. The neighbors no longer feared Carol's clipboard or her violation notices. They feared what would happen next. For weeks, Carol had been unraveling piece by piece. The pink cardigans and polished smiles were still there, but the sharpness behind her eyes had dulled into something darker: desperation. Every morning she was seen pacing her driveway, muttering to herself as she stared across the street at my house. Every evening she made her rounds in her golf cart, snapping pictures of mailboxes, fences, and driveways, as if documenting her domain before it slipped away forever. And though the Reform Committee's complaint was officially under review, the tension was already palpable. The neighborhood Facebook group was on fire. Half the residents posting screenshots of their old violations, the other half demanding a public apology from the HOA. Even those who had stayed neutral couldn't ignore it anymore. The perfect illusion of Maplewood had shattered. Carol could sense it, too. Her kingdom was collapsing. The first sign of her breaking point came one Friday morning, just days before the audit was scheduled. The HOA office, a small converted space in the clubhouse, was found unlocked, its filing cabinets open, papers scattered across the floor. Financial records, violation reports, and complaint letters were strewn everywhere, some torn, some missing. The community security footage showed no signs of forced entry, just Carol arriving late at night and leaving several hours later, carrying boxes to her car. By then, most people knew what she was trying to do: erase the evidence before it was too late. But the problem with living in a neighborhood full of cameras and nosy homeowners was that nothing truly disappeared. Neighbors had doorbell recordings, time-stamped videos, and copies of every notice she ever sent. The harder she tried to cover her tracks, the guiltier she looked. Still, she refused to back down. She clung to her authority like a lifeline, sending out mass HOA emails filled with thinly veiled threats and half-baked justifications. She insisted she was the victim of a smear campaign, that her commitment to community safety had been twisted by people with ulterior motives, but nobody believed her anymore, and, in the middle of it all, I stayed silent. I watched from my porch as the chaos unfolded, as the neighborhood slowly turned on its self-appointed queen. I didn't need to say anything. Carol was destroying herself, yet the silence seemed to bother her more than anything else. Every time she passed my house, she'd slow down, her eyes fixed on the front door, the same one I had changed the locks on weeks earlier, the spark that had ignited everything. It was as if the sight of it mocked her, reminding her that one simple act of home maintenance had set her empire on fire. Then, 3 days before the audit, things took a strange turn. That night, I noticed a faint scratching sound near my side gate. It was subtle, rhythmic, almost like someone trying to pry something loose. By the time I turned on the porch light, the noise stopped. When I stepped outside, the air was still, the street empty. But in the morning, I found the latch on the gate hanging broken. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was out of place. But someone had been there. I checked the security footage later, and there she was. Carol. At 2:13 a.m., her figure appeared in the corner of the camera's view, wearing a dark hoodie, moving slowly along the fence line. She paused at the gate, looked around, then reached toward it before the video cut off. It was the first time she had crossed the line from petty harassment to something more sinister. The footage was enough to file a report. The local police, the same department that had once saluted me, paid her a visit the next day. No arrest, just a warning. But the image of those cruisers in her driveway, the same flashing lights she had once weaponized against me, was poetic in its own way. The neighbors gathered silently at their windows, watching her being spoken to, her face pale and drawn. From that moment on, she stayed inside most of the day. Her blinds remained closed, her car unmoved. For a moment it almost seemed like it was over, like she had finally been broken. But then came the meeting. The HOA audit hearing was held in the clubhouse on a gray Thursday afternoon. Nearly every homeowner attended, cramming into the small room that had once hosted potlucks and seasonal parties. Now it was a courtroom. The air was heavy with anticipation. Carol sat at the front, a neat stack of binders beside her, each labeled in sharp, obsessive handwriting. She looked smaller somehow, her posture tight, her eyes tired, but her expression was still defiant. The board began the proceedings calmly, reviewing the evidence submitted by the Reform Committee. They went through the documentation one by one. The financial irregularities, the fabricated citations, the harassment complaints, and with each piece of evidence, Carol's expression shifted from denial to panic. When the board finally read the section about the missing HOA funds, the room fell silent. The treasurer confirmed the numbers, the auditor confirmed the discrepancies, and the decision was immediate. Carol was suspended from her position pending a full investigation. No applause, no cheers, just the collective exhale of a neighborhood released from years of control. But Carol didn't take it well. Witnesses said she stood abruptly, knocking her chair back, shouting about conspiracies and ungrateful neighbors. Her words made little sense, a frantic stream of accusations and excuses. The board members tried to calm her, but she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. That was the last time anyone saw her in public for several days. After the meeting, the neighborhood was eerily quiet. The relief people expected didn't come right away, only a strange sense of unease. It was as if everyone was waiting for something to happen, and they were right to. 2 nights later, around midnight, the sound of sirens echoed through the subdivision again. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the same street where this all began. Only this time, they weren't for me. Carol's house had caught fire. The cause was later ruled as accidental, a kitchen fire that spread quickly through the lower floor. She escaped unharmed, but the damage was severe. Some said it was a tragic accident. Others whispered it was insurance fraud, or even desperation. Either way, the sight of her once immaculate home, blackened and silent, marked the end of her reign. But what none of us realized then was that her downfall would set off a chain of events, far more complicated and far more revealing, than any of us expected. Because hidden beneath the ashes of Carol's home was something that would change everything we thought we knew about her, something that would prove she hadn't just been enforcing the rules, she'd been hiding behind them. The fire at Carol's house marked the beginning of the end for the old Maplewood Estates. For years, the neighborhood had been defined by her control. Her color-coded rule books, her surveillance disguised as community watch, her relentless obsession with perfection. But once the smoke cleared and her pink-trimmed 2-story was reduced to a hollow shell of charred siding and blackened windows, it felt as though the grip she had on everyone's lives had finally loosened. At least, that's what we thought. The fire trucks left just before dawn. The smell of burnt insulation and wet ash lingered for days, clinging to the air even after the last embers cooled. The neighbors whispered quietly from their driveways, pretending to be sympathetic but secretly relieved. Some left casseroles on her porch, as if food could fix everything. Others just avoided the street entirely, unwilling to confront the wreckage of the woman who had ruled them. Carol herself had vanished. She was seen briefly that night, wrapped in a blanket, sitting on the curb as paramedics checked her over. After that, nothing. No posts on the HOA page, no early morning patrols, no golf cart cruising down the street. It was as if she had evaporated into the same smoke that had swallowed her house. For a week, life in Maplewood Estates felt still. The quiet was unsettling, almost unnatural. Without her constant interference, the neighborhood didn't seem to know how to function. There were no new citations, no passive-aggressive reminders about lawn care or trash day. The HOA board, now leaderless, scrambled to reorganize, but even they seemed hesitant, as if speaking too loudly might summon her back. But then came the discovery. It started when a cleanup crew was sent to clear out the remains of Carol's house. The insurance company wanted to assess the damage, and with the investigation complete, they began hauling away the debris. By the second day, one of the workers found something strange in the basement, a section of wall that didn't match the rest of the foundation. The concrete was newer, the surface smoother. When they broke through it, they uncovered a hidden storage area, about the size of a small office. Inside were boxes, dozens of them. The boxes were filled with HOA documents, not the kind you'd expect like maintenance reports or meeting minutes, but personal files, each one labeled meticulously in Carol's tight handwriting. Names, addresses, and incident notes. Some contained photos, others contained printed emails, complaint letters, even financial records that had nothing to do with HOA operations. It was a secret archive, a detailed record of every neighbor Carol had ever targeted, filed away like evidence in a private investigation. When word of the discovery spread, it set off another explosion of chaos. The reform committee called an emergency meeting. The police reopened their investigation, this time looking into possible privacy violations and misuse of HOA funds. The news even picked up the story briefly. Local HOA president kept secret files on neighbors. And suddenly, Maplewood Estates wasn't just a quiet suburban community anymore. It was a spectacle. But the deeper they dug, the stranger it got. Among the documents, investigators found bank records linking Carol to several maintenance contractors that didn't exist. The names on the invoices were fake, the addresses empty lots. It was proof that she had been funneling HOA money through shell accounts for years. The financial discrepancies that had triggered the audit were just the tip of the iceberg. Even more disturbing were the personal files. Some of the photos were clearly taken from hidden vantage points, over fences, through windows, sometimes even from inside cars parked on the street. It was clear that Carol hadn't just been enforcing the rules, she had been watching everyone. The more that surfaced, the more it seemed like the entire HOA system she built wasn't about community at all. It was about control, a way to monitor and manipulate every person who lived under her domain. The neighborhood went into collective shock. People began calling the HOA office daily, demanding answers, demanding resignations. The temporary board members were overwhelmed. Some of them, who had served under Carol for years, resigned immediately, afraid of being associated with her. Others tried to restore order, promising to rebuild trust, but nobody was listening. The revelation changed everything. For me, it brought a strange kind of vindication. All those years of her nitpicking, all the smug superiority and constant intrusion, it all made sense now. She hadn't just been enforcing policy, she had been feeding an obsession. The moment she saw me changing my locks, she didn't see a homeowner maintaining his property. She saw someone acting outside her control, and that terrified her. That was why she called 911. That was why she spiraled. My defiance had cracked the illusion she'd built, and once that illusion broke, she lost herself trying to fix it. But while most people felt relief that the truth was finally out, a lingering question remained. Where was Carol now? Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said she had fled to stay with family out of state. Others believed she was still in town, hiding in one of the vacant rental properties under a false name. A few neighbors even claimed to have seen her at night, standing on the sidewalk across from my house, just watching. Nobody could prove it, but the stories kept circulating, growing stranger each time. And then a letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope, no return address. The handwriting was unmistakable. Tight, deliberate, unmistakably Carol's. It wasn't sent through the mail. It had been slipped under my door, just like her old violation notices. Inside was a single sheet of paper, burned slightly along one edge. The message was short. It said, "You don't understand what you've done. It was never about you. No signature. No date, just that." I read it twice, then again. It was vague, cryptic, but there was something about the phrasing that unsettled me. It wasn't defensive or angry. It sounded afraid. Over the next few days, more strange things happened. A car parked near my house with tinted windows and no plates. My mail went missing twice, and one night, when I checked the footage from my security cameras, I saw a faint silhouette moving near the tree line, a figure that looked a lot like her. It was impossible to tell for sure, but deep down, I knew. Carol was still here, watching. The police said there wasn't much they could do without proof, And the HOA board had bigger problems. They were too busy dismantling what was left of her empire, freezing accounts, organizing new elections, and dealing with reporters who wouldn't stop calling. But as the days turned into weeks, and the cleanup crew finished clearing the ruins of her house, I noticed something eerie. The plot of land where her house once stood remained empty, fenced off with yellow tape, untouched. The grass around it started to die, as if the ground itself didn't want to heal. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, I could still smell the faint scent of smoke drifting from that direction. It was as if the neighborhood itself was haunted, not by ghosts, but by the memory of control, paranoia, and power gone too far. Still, the story wasn't finished, because a month later, when construction crews began digging to prepare for a rebuild on Carol's lot, they found something buried beneath the concrete foundation. Something that would finally reveal what Carol had truly been protecting all those years. The day the construction crew broke ground on Carol's property was the first time in weeks that Maplewood Estates felt alive again. The trucks arrived early, their engines rumbling through the quiet cul-de-sac. Neighbors stood at their windows or gathered in small clusters on the sidewalks, watching curiously as the excavators began tearing through the remains of Carol's foundation. The once pristine lot, now just a scorched patch of earth, surrounded by caution tape, had been a haunting reminder of everything that had happened. But what none of us knew that morning was that the ground beneath that house still held secrets. The first sign that something wasn't right came when the crew hit an unexpected layer of concrete beneath the main slab, thicker, older, and uneven compared to the rest of the foundation. It wasn't part of the original blueprints. When they broke through it, a hollow space opened up below. One of the workers, thinking it might be an old storm shelter or root cellar, climbed down to check. Minutes later, he stumbled back out, pale and shaking. The police were called immediately, and soon the street was swarming with cruisers again. The same flashing lights that had once been a symbol of Carol's authority now signaling the final collapse of it. The entire area was cordoned off as investigators descended into the hole, flashlights flickering against the darkness below. The rest of us could only watch from behind the barricade, hearts pounding, wondering what could possibly be buried under there. When the first officer emerged, carrying a small evidence bag, the crowd fell silent. Inside were several folders sealed in plastic, their edges yellowed with age. More followed, boxes, binders, and even an old metal filing cabinet, rusted shut and half buried in the dirt. But that wasn't all they found. Beneath the layers of paperwork and debris were several safes, all hidden under a layer of poured concrete. They had been deliberately sealed away, protected from discovery. When the safes were opened, the truth of what Carol had been doing finally came to light. Inside were documents that went far beyond the HOA. They contained property deeds, tax records, and forged contracts. Evidence of illegal land deals stretching back more than a decade. Carol had been using her position as HOA president to manipulate property values, buying foreclosed or violated homes through shell companies, then reselling them for profit. The petty rules, the constant citations, the harassment. It had all been part of a much larger scheme. Every fine, every threat, every anonymous complaint had been carefully orchestrated to push homeowners out so she could swoop in and acquire their properties for next to nothing. The scale of it was staggering. Dozens of homes, not just in Maplewood Estates but in neighboring communities, had been affected. She had created an empire of fraud, hidden behind the mask of neighborhood management and civic duty. The discovery spread through the community like wildfire. The news vans returned, the cameras flashing as headlines screamed across the state. HOA president accused of property fraud. After fire reveals secret bunker. For the first time, the entire town saw Carol for who she truly was. Not just a controlling neighbor, but a calculating criminal who had used fear and bureaucracy to build her own fortune. But for me, the revelation struck deeper. Because as the investigation unfolded, one more thing came to light. Something personal. Among the documents recovered was a file with my name on it. Inside, there were photos of my house, copies of old HOA notices, and even a background check she'd ordered years before. There was also a printout of the police report from the day she called 911 on me, annotated in her handwriting, analyzing every detail of what had happened. And at the back of the file was a note, handwritten, unlike her usual typed reports. It was dated several months before the lock-changing incident. It said, "Do not engage with him. Former military. Connected. Dangerous if provoked." The words chilled me. She had known exactly who I was before that day. Before she called the police. Before she staged her little power play. The entire scene that had humiliated her, the salute, the loss of face, hadn't been an accident. She had engineered it, thinking she could assert control over me the way she had over everyone else. She just hadn't expected it to backfire. In that moment, I realized that everything, from the first violation letter to the last midnight visit, had been part of a larger obsession. For years, she had treated Maplewood like her personal chessboard, and every homeowner had been a pawn. When I refused to play by her rules, she lost control, and her empire began to crumble. The irony was that her undoing came not from an outsider or a rival, but from her own need to dominate. She had buried her crimes beneath the very house she ruled from, as if trying to hide her guilt in plain sight. And in doing so, she'd ensured it would one day be unearthed. The police investigation continued for weeks. Forensic accountants traced the money, uncovering layers of fraud, theft, and identity manipulation. The amount she had stolen was staggering, enough to buy several homes outright. Warrant after warrant was issued, and though she was nowhere to be found, it became clear that her time as a fugitive was limited. Eventually, the news reported that she'd been caught several towns over, living under a false name. She'd been renting a small apartment, paying in cash, keeping to herself. When they arrested her, she didn't resist. She just went quietly, as if she'd been expecting it all along. When the footage of her arrest aired on the evening news, the neighborhood gathered in silence to watch. There she was, the same woman who once held court over every cracked driveway and faded fence, now in handcuffs, led into the back of a police cruiser. For the first time, Maplewood Estates felt peaceful. The HOA was dissolved and rebuilt from scratch under new leadership. The Reform Committee became the foundation for a fairer, transparent system. The endless surveillance, the petty fines, the fear, all of it was gone. And yet sometimes when I walk past her old lot, now cleared and fenced off, I still feel the echo of what she built. A reminder of how control, once taken too far, can rot everything it touches. The neighbors still talk about her sometimes, though not with anger anymore. More like disbelief. That one woman's obsession with power could spiral so far out of control. Her name has become a cautionary tale, a whispered story told to newcomers. Be careful who you put in charge of your HOA. As for me, I replaced my locks again not long after it all ended. Not because I needed to, but because it felt symbolic. A final act of taking back what was always mine. And this time, when I turned the key, the sound wasn't just the click of a lock securing a door. It was the sound of freedom, the sound of peace, returning to a neighborhood that had forgotten what it felt like to breathe. The police never saluted me again after that day. They didn't have to. The salute had already done its work. It had exposed the truth, shattered an illusion, and ended the reign of the woman who thought she could control everything. And in the quiet that followed, Maplewood Estates became what it was always supposed to be. Not a prison of rules and fear, but a community finally free of the shadow that had ruled it for too long.